Is there a new focus on Palestinian rights? And are more people in the U.S. seeing this conflict framed through social justice and the issue of human rights?
There is absolutely no question that we are seeing this very significant shift in public perceptions, in part due to what Razan herself has just outlined in terms of technology, just giving people access directly into what's happening on the ground in Palestine in a way that does not necessarily always have to be filtered through corporate media in the United States, which still continues to cover this issue not so greatly, still with a lot of false equivalences and missing context. But also, there's a lot of mobilization from the ground up here within the United States. There is grassroots activism in support of Palestinian human rights. There is so many, the diversity of the American Jewish community is now on full display with so many more progressive organizations, Jewish organizations emerging to challenge AIPAC, the traditional pro-Israel lobby. And we are at a point right now where a majority of Democrats favor reducing American military funding to Israel because of Israel's violations of Palestinian human rights. That is a massive, massive shift. This did not used to be the case 20 years ago or 10 years ago. And that is leading us to this moment right now where more and more members of Congress, particularly on the Democratic side of the aisle, are willing to challenge Israeli behavior and American support for Israeli behavior and demanding that the United States hold Israel accountable. And this is certainly looks like the beginning of a much broader shift, that we're moving in the right direction in a country that is becoming much more socially conscious all around, with the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, the environmental justice movement, and just about every movement that's trying to create a better and more equitable and just world. And we're seeing that spill into American foreign policy as well.
Omar, there's been so much reporting the last several days about how much pressure President Biden might be putting on Prime Minister Netanyahu in order to try to get a ceasefire to come about. Now, I've heard you say that a ceasefire alone will not resolve the Israel-Palestine conflict and that a ceasefire does not address these underlying issues that have been at play for so long. I mean, on Twitter, you wrote, "We remain far from justice." So from your vantage point, what are the steps that need to be taken to begin to address all of this on a fundamental and lasting level?
I think we should remember that Biden's initial response to Israel's devastation of Gaza was to insist that Israel was only defending itself and that it's not doing anything wrong and is not overreacting. He essentially reverted to the standard mantra of American presidents, which is to simply back Israel no matter what Israel does. And it was only intense pressure from within his own party, including a confrontation with Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, a Palestinian American, by the way, which reminds you why representation actually matters, that he eventually changed his tune and started calling for de-escalation and telling Israel that he really expects a ceasefire to be in the works immediately. And what we currently need right now is to make sure that this pressure remains sustained. We can't have pressure on the Biden administration only when Israel is carrying out massive massacres against Palestinians. It has to be sustained during times of the status quo, which is the lower intensity violence that Palestinians are experiencing every single day. Just today, Israeli forces have attacked the Al-Aqsa compound once again, beating up and protesters and firing stun grenades. This is the reality of life for Palestinians every single day. They are under the complete and total control of the Israeli military. They have no voice. They have no right to vote for the government that controls their lives. They don't control their own borders. In the case of the people in Gaza, they do not even have access to clean water, do not have the ability to trade with the outside world. So they're completely economically suffocated. If they go out fishing, they get shot at by the Israeli Navy. This is an unacceptable reality right now where Palestinians do not have the most basics of human rights or any freedom at all. And as long as that injustice is in place, we are going to continue in a situation that is just bound to result in more and more violence. And you have the people in Sheikh Jarrah who are still under the threat of ethnic cleansing simply for being Palestinian. So if the United States is going to be serious about putting human rights first, as the Biden administration has repeated multiple times since he's taking office, then we need to see the Biden administration be held accountable to those words. And that comes through sustained and relentless pressure so that Israel, I'm pretty sure that what Netanyahu is counting on right now is that whatever pressure Biden came under was temporary and they can pull back a little bit, but then continue carrying on the way they have. But that is the fundamental issue. We have to get to a point where the United States does not supply unconditional military funding to Israel and does not offer unconditional diplomatic protection at the United Nations, vetoing every effort to hold Israel accountable if we're going to see a meaningful change. And that's precisely what we have to keep pushing for.